This is They Create Worlds, episode 248, An Act of Control.
If anybody wants to find me, I'll be in the last place you would look. In a place where people used to be, a land that's called reality, you'll find me there.
Welcome to They Create Worlds. I'm Jeffrey, and I'm joined by my co-host, Alex.
Hello.
We join you once again for the holiday season. What's better for the holiday season than to sit around a fire, cozy up with your favorite hot drink, blankets, perhaps a fuzzy companion, and listen about the glory, the horrors, and tribulations of Japanese game centers' legal shenanigans.
Indeed. Devoted listeners may recall that before our entire Commodore situation, 4 episodes, we had thought that we were going to do this episode before we did our live stream. Turns out that life got in the way of that and we didn't have time to record and edit another episode before all that live stream stuff. But we are returning to it now to take a look at the Act on Control and Improvement of Amusement Business, a unique law in Japan that came to regulate game centers and require not just licensing, but put some prescriptions on when they could operate and when minors could be present in the facilities, etc. As a law, it's mostly straightforward. We could deal with that in 10 seconds, but what makes this worthy of an episode is it's really kind of nuts how this thing all came about and where the regulation of video games in arcades, in game centers, came from in Japan. So it's a kind of interesting story about moral panic and regulation. There are obviously interesting stories around that in other parts of the world as well. In the United States, it was more focused on pinball than it ever was on coin-operated video games. Certainly, you see these stories in other places, but this is a law that's still in effect in Japan, and it definitely had a massive impact on the way the Japanese video game industry developed as regulation became more and more of a threat and then a reality as the early 1980s progressed. There's a pretty interesting story here that we can kind of dispense with in a single episode and just show how the law can get in the way of all of our fun sometimes, Jeffrey.
Well, I mean, you and I are no stranger to that. We've lived through a few of those over the years. That's something that seemed to be kind of prevalent with anything that's new and different. We see that today in various forms. We see the same pattern happen in the past. Older generations don't understand something the younger generations are doing, which could be completely innocuous and blind in most cases. It's blown out of proportion and it becomes the panic thing of the moment.
Absolutely.
You have that with the comics in the 50s and 60s.
Yeah.
You had that with Dungeons and Dragons in the 70s.
Yeah.
You had that with video games, especially in the 90s.
You skipped a decade, heavy metal music in the 80s.
Yep.
If we want to throw something else in there.
Oh, yeah. I figured you could fill in the gaps.
Yeah, no, I mean, this does happen. And there was an element of moral panic to this, which we'll certainly see. But some of it was also just because of the real blurring of the lines in Japan, especially. It's not the only place where this is true, but especially true there, between gambling and amusement. This is what also, in addition to moral panics, kind of spurred a lot of the panic over pinball, which we've talked about before in the United States. That had kind of all been resolved by the time video games came along in the U.S. And while there were other reasons to have moral panic in the U.S., that didn't tend to be one of them. But in Japan, this was really being confronted, maybe not quite for the first time, but in a really big way in the 1970s and 1980s. You just had people that really couldn't understand the difference because everything was so new between video games that were purely amusement and video games that may be used for gambling, which led to a lot of the shenanigans that we're going to cover. It's an interesting story. Can't wait to tell it here.
So which decade do we start with? The 70s, the 80s, the 90s? Where do we want to focus on for the start of this? Where the law came from? Do we want to set up where game centers came from? Because we covered that before. We covered where a lot of these game centers came from. We even talked about this law a few times over the years. about how it really shaped, scared, and defined how Japanese game centers changed. There was time before the law and time after the law, and just everyone going, hey, kids need to be in school. They can't be robbing kids of lunch money to play these video game things at 3 a.m. We need to regulate that.
Absolutely. The regulation that we're going to be talking about came into effect in February of 1985. But that's not our starting point. We're going to go back and give some context. And no, we're not going to talk about the entire history of game centers again, because we did that very early in the history of this podcast. But much of that still holds up today, despite the fact that it's such an early episode. But we do need to go back, and some of this will be repeat, some of this will be new, but all of it is within a different frame of reference or different context. We do need to talk a little bit about amusement in Japan and where it intersects with gambling and where that created gray areas that are creating a lot of the problems that we have that led to this law. First of all, a little bit of an overview of the law itself, the Act on Control and Improvement of Amusement Business. This is a law that was first created in 1948, so very early after World War II. There had been regulation of many of these things before World War II as well, but this is obviously World War II. It was, the end of that entire system of government and everything was being reestablished. So the law was created in 1948 and was updated a few times after that. It basically regulates two types of businesses, which are businesses that offer certain types of food and entertainment, like hostess bars, dance halls, cabarets, and later on, amusement arcades, though not in its first form. And then also businesses involved in the sex industry, bathhouses, love hotels, sex shops, adult movie theaters, strip clubs, etc. The reason for this is almost entirely tied up in kind of the think of the children mentality. There is a version of the law that's been translated that's available online that is the law as it stood in 2019. I don't know if the law's been updated since then. I'm not an expert on Japanese law, but that's what we have online, and we can put that in the show notes for people who want to read the law as it looks like today. The purpose of the law, as stated by the law itself, is the purpose of this act is to regulate the business hours and business areas, etc., concerning amusement businesses and sex-related businesses, etc., and to regulate the entrance of youths to such places of business, etc. They like the word etc., at least in the translation, for the purpose of maintaining public morals and wholesome social environment and preventing acts that hamper the sound development of youths, and also to provide measures to promote the proper operation of such businesses in order to contribute to improving the propriety of amusement businesses, etc. The idea is if you're involved in these areas, some of which are legal, I guess all of which are legal because this is a control act, if you're in any of these areas, your business needs to be licensed. And the main reason for that is we're going to make sure that you keep things to a minimum standard of propriety for the good of society as a whole, but also that we're going to be extra vigilant in making sure that these businesses do not cater to children and that children are not exposed to the activities of these businesses that might be detrimental to their development. It's a kind of regulation that you don't see in quite the same way in the United States. In the United States, the police power, the ability to regulate the health, welfare, safety, and morals of the populace is a power that remains with the states and with subunits of the states. In the United States, you don't, in general, see national laws of this kind. There might be some states that regulate some of these areas more, some of these areas less, but there's a very different, for our American listeners, there's a very different approach here, a very paternal approach to mandating certain standards of operation, particularly hours of operation, lighting levels, cleanliness, that kind of thing, through this act. It is meant to apply to businesses that are considered adult for one reason or another. Not all of them are sex-related businesses, though a huge section of them are. Some of them, as we've said as well, are the food and drink business as well. Amusement machines, insofar as they can intersect with gambling. And that's kind of the big thing here, and why there's kind of this misunderstanding or a lot of confusion around this in Japan as this law's evolving over the decades, because of the way amusements in Japan, since outright gambling is not allowed, or at least is generally not allowed. Again, I'm not a complete expert on Japanese law, but my understanding is historically gambling has not been allowed. The first amusements that entered Japan were really entering on the basis of amusement. But over time, there developed gray markets around many of these machines. So there was a real blurring of the lines between, is this amusement or is this gambling? And if we can't tell the difference, then to be safe, we just have to kind of regulate all of it. And that's kind of the mentality that developed over time. And the first to be regulated was pachinko. We're not going to go into the whole history of pachinko again, but pachinko had been a children's amusement primarily before World War II. After World War II, when it came back, it became a gray market gambling kind of game. This is usually linked to the idea that right after the war, when the economy was not doing well, when people were struggling to even get basic necessities, pachinko parlors offered the opportunity to win prizes like soap and cigarettes and other things that were really hard to come by naturally. The idea is that you would play these machines, you're launching all of these balls, and then as you get balls into scoring pockets, other balls are being spit out, and you've got this cycle of balls in motion all the time, and at the end of the game, you'll have some balls left over. These are your prize, and then you would take them around and exchange them for your prizes, kind of like using chips at a casino, except in this case, chips in a casino was a way really to get people to not think of what they were wagering as money. I'm just wagering a piece of plastic, so I'm not concerned about how many chips I'm going through because they're not real money. In this case, it's the opposite of that. It's prizes. We're not allowed to award direct prizes on our machines because this kind of gambling's illegal, but we can have this other completely innocuous item that we then have you take around the corner to exchange for a prize. We've talked about that in some of our other episodes.
Also in a video from abroad in Japan, he does a really good look at the Japanese pachinko industry and how it's set up, how it does hurt areas of the population. And you might be thinking, well, why? Why don't we do this? We have things like Atlantic City, Vegas, and other stuff in the States anyway.
Right.
There is a real impact there. Now, where that balance is something that people will probably argue over for the rest of the existence of humanity. Just to give you an idea of how the situation is in Japan as of roughly 7 years ago, it gives you an idea of what we're talking about here. And I mean, this is really popular. I know, Alex, you and I, when we played Dragon Quest III, Dragon Quest IV,
sure,
and many of the Dragon Quest that came after that, there's usually a casino somewhere in the game, usually in the more shadier Den of Thieves area. Not all the time, but sometimes, usually there.
Sure.
It's very much like that. You go in, you spend your money to get tokens, and then you use the tokens in order to play slot machines, poker, bet on monster fights, what have you, and then you get a whole bunch of tokens as a reward, and then you can take those tokens to get rare and unique weapons and armor and trinkets from the prize counter that only takes tokens. You can't just go in there with your massive amounts of gold and just buy it.
Right.
And usually the exchange rate's pretty atrocious because it's something like 20 gold per one token or something like that.
Right. That comes directly out of that culture. Pachinko was very quickly added to the law as a so-called Type 7 business because there were multiple categories of business. Pachinko parlors were added to this list of controlled businesses in 1953, so just a few years after the law had been in place. Before that, billiard halls and mahjong parlors had been classified as amusement businesses. Then in 1953, pachinko was the first coin-operated game to be added to this list. And this didn't mean that pachinko was suddenly banned. But what it did mean is that it was going to be regulated, that you would have to adhere to certain standards around hours, around the way you operate, and that you would be paying licensing fees, and that the National Public Safety Commission and the National Police Agency had the ability to coordinate enforcement against you. The National Police Agency, and I'm not an expert on anything Japan, but Japan doesn't have a national police force per se, is my understanding, but they do have a national police agency, which serves as a coordinating body that coordinates the activities of regional police forces, district police forces. They answer to a National Public Safety Commission, which establishes a lot of the rules and regulations around the interactions of the National Police Agency and the people. The National Police Agency is the group that is largely responsible for coordinating enforcement of this law. And then the National Public Safety Commission establishes a lot of the regulations to enforce the law, filling in the gaps in the law itself, similar to how regulatory agencies in the United States functions. That's my understanding anyway. If I get anything wrong, do please write in, because I fully admit that these aren't my areas of first expertise. The way that the law defined amusement businesses that needed to be regulated, the way it's still defined today, is that they are businesses that are likely to arouse what they call a spirit of speculation between customers. That's a fancy way of saying they are activities that are likely to involve placing wagers, placing bets, doing gambling. The authorities kind of viewed this spirit of speculation thing in two different ways. One of those is just activities that historically involved wagering, like going back to the dawn of time have usually involved wagering. So that's why billiard halls and mahjong parlors were part of this act, because billiards, it has a history, pool has a history of having betting on outcomes, betting on games, and so did mahjong. Then there's the activities that involve like a direct gain or loss of property through machines. So that's where kind of pachinko comes in. They're new, relatively new. I mean, they'd been around before the war, but they're relatively new. So there's not necessarily the long history, but this is a direct, you are putting money in, you are taking your remaining balls and getting prizes. It's a game of chance where you have a chance to win prizes. There's a direct property and loss. This idea of arousing the spirit of speculation is what's really going to matter in video games. Because video games by and large, and we'll get to some potential exceptions, but video games by and large don't have that direct profit loss thing. Yeah, sometimes you can get prizes. I'm sure you remember going to the arcades back in the 80s and 90s and getting all sorts of tickets spitting out of your machine that you could then take to get some little prize. Or you could try to save up 10,000 tickets to get the big prize that you could have bought for way less in real money than the amount of quarters you put into an arcade machine to get 10,000 tickets.
Yeah, that's something I've tried to instill into my children. Not easy to do.
Right.
I'm sure any parent who's taken a kid to any kind of modern arcade where they have a lot of the redemption games, it's all the flashy lights, they see the prize, they're like, ooh, I can almost get that thing. And they get so close, and it's that dopamine hit of almost getting there, getting them to realize that you're getting a lot less entertainment out of your swipe of your card doing that than you are by playing some of these other video games where you can play the game for a good couple minutes.
Exactly. There's some of that kind of thing, but in general, that's not the kind of thing that the police agency was interested in. And in fact, when crane machines started getting popular, where you do wager money for a prize, essentially, they specifically made some exceptions around crane machines that as long as the prizes were within a certain price range, that they weren't subject to regulation. They weren't really interested in that. But the October 1955, and a lot of this, I should say, as we go on, a lot of the information I'm getting comes from the great history of coin-operated video games, coin-operated games in general, though, with a focus on video games. Written by Masumi Akagi, it began with Pong. It has not been translated into English officially. Me and some other people have done some machine translations and whatnot to get at the aspects of it. But he was a longtime industry insider, ran Game Machine magazine, which was one of the main trade publications. So really understood the coin-op industry and wrote a comprehensive history. That's not the only source we're pulling from for everything, but that is the biggest source we're pulling from. So a lot of the information comes from there. As he was explaining this in his book, he quoted the October 1955 directive of the National Police Agency, going way back, which further categorized this idea of amusements likely to arouse a spirit of speculation and divided them into two types. One, those in which a benefit is provided based on the result of play. That's the kind of thing that, pachinko could be getting into trouble on. And two, those in which, according to social convention, the nature of the play is considered likely to arouse a spirit of speculation, which is where the idea of regulating billiard halls and mahjong parlors came from. And in fact, in 1955, they removed billiard halls from the category because nobody, I guess, in Japan was really wagering on pool anymore at that time. I don't know the social history. That seems to be what happened. So they decided that they wouldn't regulate that anymore.
As opposed to pool hustling in the United States.
Indeed. So for the most part, outside of pachinko, Japan's coin-op industry was not really impacted by this law in its early years. In the 50s, 60s, 70s, etc., for the most part, not affected, because the games at that time were, in the electromechanical days, they were largely driving games and shooting games, target shooting games. There are a few other examples of things, but those were the primary ones. Neither of those activities would be historically considered to, according to social convention, arouse a spirit of speculation. Obviously, anyone can wager on anything if they want to, but we're talking about things where it was actually common to do so. You didn't bet on people driving around in auto simulators. You didn't bet on people doing target shooting. The games themselves were not awarding prizes. So that was all considered fine. That kind of thing wasn't regulated. The early video games were the same way, because, of course, the early video games, they were mostly ball and paddle games. They were based on table tennis. They were based on hockey. They were based on soccer. We've done a million episodes on ball and paddle games. We don't have to get into that. But it's the same idea that table tennis is not a game that there was historically widespread betting on, so it was not likely to arouse a spirit of speculation. Again, we're not talking about betting on professional sports, right? Because obviously, betting on professional sports, whether legal or illegal, has always been a big business. We're not talking about that kind of sports betting. We're talking about two people coming together and being like, let's play a game of table tennis together, and to make it interesting, the loser pays the winner $50. We're not talking about, I'm going to bet on the outcome of this table tennis competition between the Japanese and Chinese national teams. We're talking about two players and what they would do. That kind of betting just wasn't done. So when you have games based on table tennis, soccer, hockey, no matter how abstract they were in the early ball and paddle games, that was pretty harmless too. The coming of video games did not, in and of itself, cause some kind of panic related to the morals of the youth as applied to gambling or delinquency or whatever else. The problem really began to develop as the lines began to blur in other areas in the 1970s. So at the very beginning of the 1970s, there was a new craze for a particular type of German gambling machine called a rooftops machine. The way these rooftops machines worked, and we can put some examples in the show notes, is that you had these spinning discs with numbers on them, and you had the ability to try to press a button to time when the reels would stop to line up numbers. In some ways, it's a similar concept to a slot machine, but the difference with a rooftops machine is you're actually given a little bit of control. It's still not really a game of skill, but you're given a little bit of an ability to try to influence the outcome. So around 1972, these rooftops machines became very popular. They appeared a little bit before that, but by 1972, they were incredibly popular in Japan. This would also be the beginnings, the origins of patchy slot machines, which, run under a similar concept. These kind of amusements that were quasi kind of games of chance, or were games of chance with a almost pretend element of skill to them, were starting to really threaten traditional amusement spaces and traditional amusement games. the target shooting games and driving games and all of this stuff that you found at the time in supermarkets and in coffee houses and rooftops of department stores. Not so much dedicated game centers at that time, though there were a few larger gun corners that could qualify as game centers. Bowling alleys, of course, games were popular. But in this period, you had the bowling fad ending, which was cutting off a major resource for amusement games. And you were also having this arrival of these rudiment machines that were really changing the nature of the business. This is what led the amusement industry to make the shift, as we talked about in our Game Center episode, into medal games. Medal, M-E-D-A-L, not metal, M-E-T-A-L. We've talked about these before in other episodes, and this is also akin to what you were talking about with the Dragon Quest Casino thing, which is where you would have various machines that looked very much like gambling machines. You would have slot machines, you would have roulette-style machines, you would have horse racing kind of electromechanical machines. They would play like gambling machines. They would play like slot machines or rudiment machines or roulette wheels or whatever else. But except that instead of paying out in coins, they paid out in just medals, these discs, which is, again, similar to the Dragon Quest thing. This was seen as a way of allowing patrons to experience some of the thrill of gambling without actually doing real gambling, because money was ostensibly not changing hands. I mean, you paid to play, because, of course, the business have to make a profit. They're coin-operated machines, but you're not gambling. You're not trying to win a prize. You're not trying to win money. That was really the beginning of the game center business in Japan as we think of it today, which we talked about before. The first big one, not necessarily the very first one established, but the one that gained huge amounts of popularity, was the game Fantasia Milano from Sigma Enterprises in 1971. It had this whole casino atmosphere to it in terms of the ambiance and the decor, in addition to the machines. This represented a new era in amusements in Japan. The driving games and shooting games and all of that didn't go away, of course, but there was a real shift in the early 1970s to these kind of medal games, and these games overshadowed everything else in Japan, including the early video games. In fact, we've talked about some of the early video game companies actually got their start in medal games, like Konami, which we talked about, and others, even though they didn't get their start in that area, pivoted very hard when they became popular, like Sega, which had been purveying traditional amusements before that, but really heavily embraced medal games as well. This was kind of the future of the business, and very quickly we can see how this would lead to problems with the control law and with the National Police Agency, because at this point, Jeffrey, we are really blurring that line between what is amusement and what is gambling. When we're like, sure, this is a slot machine, just like the slot machines they use in Las Vegas, except that instead of paying out in coins or in some kind of tokens that you can exchange for coins, they're just worthless medals that are harmless and nobody does anything with afterwards, I promise.
A lot more tongue-in-cheek than, I would say, arguably how the United States dealt with gambling and questionable devices, where we panicked a lot more over pinball machines and other stuff. They actually did have things that were much more blurry the line.
Exactly. And, and even in the United States, this happened in pinball some as well. I mean, part of the reason the panic started is there were starting to be payout machines.
Gotcha.
Yeah, but absolutely. That quickly spread to kind of all kinds of pinball machines. And we see something similar happen with medal games a little bit, because very quickly there does start to be a gray market. There are businesses that are like, and now just take your medals around the corner and get yourself a hat of happiness or something like that. Bonus points if you get that reference.
But I like my hat of happiness, Alex. It's the only reason I was able to live.
Well, then you need to spend a lot of time playing them poker and slots, Jeffrey. Absolutely. So that gray market stuff was going on. There was a great distrust, and it never got to the point in this era that the medal machines were officially regulated, but it did get to the point where the industry self-regulated, which is a topic that'll come up a couple of times here. The Japan Amusement Association, the JAA, which was the trade organization of amusement machine manufacturers in Japan, did in November 1973 promulgate what they called the Standards for the Operation of Medal Game Halls, which were basically meant to prohibit minors from playing the machines and regulating the awarding of prizes. They really wanted to make sure that children, especially, were being kept away from these things, because the amusement control law was really more than anything about children. As it said in the very first article of the Act, stating the purpose is that they want to maintain public morals and wholesome social environment and prevent acts that hamper the sound development of youths. So that's, again, where some of the concern was, because obviously games are played by children. They want to kind of separate the adult entertainment from the children's entertainment. And so they self-regulated. These self-regulations essentially had the force of law, because they would cooperate with the National Police Agency, and the National Police Agency would help them enforce these regulations as if they were laws. It's similar to how the motion picture industry in America self-regulates R-rated movies. You technically have to have the permission of a parent to get in or whatever. It's the same idea, except I think that there's even closer cooperation with the authorities, so that these self-regulations almost have the impact of law. That mostly kind of took care of things for metal games, to my understanding. The lines were blurred even more 2 years later, 1975, when a lot of children's metal game machines started showing up in locations such as candy shops, where they were specifically targeted at children, which kind of made things hazy. There was a lot of cracking down on metal games, and in fact, as the 70s go on, metal games start to fade in importance because of the crackdown, but the crackdown on metal games kind of stays informal and doesn't rise to the level of being regulated by the law. The law is not amended at this time, to my understanding, to actually include those. That all brings us then to Space Invaders.
We've talked about that one before. We got a whole episode.
We have. And we also talked about the moral panic around Space Invaders, so we're not going to go super in-depth here. But Space Invaders is the next part of the story, because this is the first time that video games come under attack. There are two elements to the attack on Space Invaders. One of them is that same old story that we hear all the time, which is that the game is corrupting the youth. The same thing we've heard about other video games, the same thing we heard about pinball in the United States. It's corrupting the youth, because even though these are amusement games, they are compulsive, they are addictive. Teens and even younger kids are pumping their quarters into them, spending all their money. When they run out of money, they're beating up their peers for lunch money. They're stealing from their parents to get 100 yen coins to put in the machines. They're just hanging out around these machines. They're congregating all day long. Arcades tend to be dimly lit. Game centers tend to be dimly lit in the video era, because it makes it easier to see the monitors. You're trying to cut down on that contrast with the overhead lighting. So the idea is these game centers are open 24/7, which they were at the time. So you'll have kids congregating there. It's dimly lit, so they can hide out in the corners and do all sorts of bad things. They're stealing money to play them. It's bad, bad, bad. That's one aspect of it, the juvenile delinquency aspect, which falls under the amusement control law as well. It's not just the gambling side, because it's about moral society and not preventing the moral development of youth. Becoming a hangout for delinquents would be harmful to the youth under the control law. But then the other side of it is older people, people who didn't understand these amusements, assumed there must be something else going on. They assumed there must be some kind of reward. They weren't necessarily going in and playing the games to find out. They're saying there must be some kind of reward, because who would put so much money into these games if they weren't getting something back in return?
It stands to reason.
Yeah, that was the logic. You know, it wasn't just, oh, kids are having fun playing this. It's like, there must be something going on. And of course, there's a history of this. I mean, pachinko games have a history of gray market prize giving. Metal games have a history of gray market prize giving. I mean, it's not coming completely out of the blue. It's not 100% completely baseless conspiracy, because there are other examples of this kind of thing going on.
You have to look at it in the context of the time and what people had as knowledge. Video games were not a thing that the general public had a context to understand.
Mm-hmm.
And it wasn't until the generation that grew up on it had kids of their own and go, oh, you're playing video games? Yeah, I did that. Here's how to put some reasonable expectations on it. but we are not losing our heads over the amount of money being spent on this because you're not gambling.
Sure. Exactly.
But it is understandable to think of the only context of parents who grew up in the 60s, 70s. Well, in my history context, it's pool, it's pachinko, it's other gambling or gambling adjacent things that, okay, yeah, some of these might be fun to an extent, but really they're trying to get that dopamine hit and get that prize. They're dumping in all this money for a prize. I might not be able to see what that prize is from my outside viewpoint, but there has to be something. It stands to reason. That's my worldview. That's my context.
Yeah. Even with video games, because, video games have been around in Japan for a little bit by this time. They'd been around as long as they had in the U.S., since the early 70s. There had been a breakout boom. We've talked about that. There had been other video games that had been popular. Space Invaders dwarfed all of that. And we have to remember that as popular as Space Invaders or Pac-Man were in the United States, Space Invaders was more popular in Japan. Like, this is an order of magnitude beyond anything that had been seen in amusement space. It dwarfed the popularity of Breakout. There were 300,000 either Space Invaders machines, Space Invaders variants, illegal counterfeits, clones. Add them all together, Invader-type games, there were like 300,000 of them. We have to remember that Japan is about the size of California by land area.
It's insane.
Yeah.
We ourselves had to perpetuate the thing of, hey, the whole coin thing.
Right.
And how that had no truth. Then it had truth.
Right.
We had to go back and revisit it a few times as a result.
Yeah.
And that's because Space Invaders were that popular, which is insane.
Right. When Pac-Man fever hit the United States a couple of years later, Midway produced 96,000 cabinets of Pac-Man. There were probably some clones and gray market imports that added to that number, but that was the biggest thing to hit American arcades. And you're talking about a third of the units across the entire United States. Huge country. Compared to what was, the 300,000 Invader games in Japan in a land area about the size of California. In part, you can almost understand it. Even if people did understand video games, this is so above and beyond. It's like, certainly there's something else going on here because Breakout was popular, but we didn't see this. Something else must be going on here. And then it wasn't helped that in some cases, there were payouts going on with Invader-type games. Again, that blurring of the line, because as we talked about, Space Invaders brought a lot of new people into the business. People were converting their stores of other types, their storefronts of other types, into Invader houses. So you had an influx of operators that had no idea how the coin-operated amusement business worked, and some of them also thought, if they're spending all of this money, we need to give them something in return. So they might add ticket dispensers or prizes. I don't know that this was widespread, but it was definitely happening. So there was a blurring of the line here, and there was this extreme suspicion of these video games from the corruption of the youth angle, which was very big, delinquents hanging out in game centers, stealing money to play games, but also the gambling element, the spirit of speculation that is so central to the law. The National Police Agency basically went to the JAA and said, you need to control this or we will. So we talked about this in our Space Invaders episode, but there was regulation around Invader games. On June 2nd, 1979, the JAA issued what it called the Voluntary Restraint Declaration on the operation of Invader-type game machines, which had 4 points to it. Machines should only be installed in locations with an attendant. People under 15 should not be allowed to play unless accompanied by a guardian. No one under 18 should be admitted after 11 p.m. Game centers ran 24/7 back then. And do not provide prizes. If somebody gets the high score on the machine, don't give them a prize for it. This basically killed the boom overnight because it really restricted the ability of the youth to play these games. It also created a stigma around them. Why do we have to restrict children from playing these games? Why can't we let people under 15 come without a guardian? Why can't we let anyone hang out after 11 p.m.? Part of the logic there is kids shouldn't be out at 11 p.m. But still, there must be something kind of sinister about this if we're having to regulate it. And so it shut down the boom. It had been going on for a while. I'm sure there were some market saturation issues as well. But basically, this shut down the Space Invaders boom overnight, which was kind of a big preview. It's like, if this level of voluntary regulation can kill off such a major boom, what happens if the government actually regulates us, actually gets in our business, which gives it even more stigma? That's a very worrying thing from this point forward.
Not to mention, you don't have any say into what those regulations are.
Yeah, exactly.
They could regulate something that might be actually completely innocuous, but fundamentally breaks the business model, and it's gone.
Exactly. The law is not amended in response to Space Invaders and Invader-type games, but shots are definitely fired across the bow. Now we need to take things forward a little later into the 1980s, just a couple of years later in the 1980s. After Space Invaders, there is not a comparable hit in Japanese game centers. Pac-Man fever is not a thing in Japan in the way it is in the United States. That isn't to say that some games don't do well in Japan, but there is not a comparable hit, and there are a couple of things that are going on here that are inhibiting that a little bit. One of them is this constant threat of regulation, and so they're being conservative. The other thing is the copyright situation, which we did an episode on copyright law too, is creating a real problem. One of the reasons Pac-Man is not as big a hit in Japan as it was in the United States is that Namco is unable to keep ahead of rapid cloning of the game because there is no copyright protection for games in Japan. The other really bad thing in terms of just the cloning in general is that organized crime, the Yakuza, start really getting involved in this counterfeiting operation. It's a complete Wild West gray area because there is no copyright law. In 1982, there finally will be, but it takes a while to get there. So there's organized crime elements infiltrating the business. I think we talked about in our Konami episode how the founder of Konami, Kagemasa Kozuki, accidentally set off a war between rival Yakuza clans because one was counterfeiting the game Scramble. So he went to another one for help, and a little turf war started over it. Like, this was serious, and I'm sure this was something that was being reported to some degree in the papers, and so there was some organized crime connection starting to be made with these games. Even more importantly than that, in the absence of a major amusement hit, game centers started moving into that same gray area that pachinko way back in the day in the 40s and metal games in the 70s had gotten into. There were two types of machines in particular, both kind of introduced in 1981, that were part of this. One of these were mahjong machines. For the first time, mahjong was being computerized. Mahjong games would remain a staple in Japanese game centers for a year afterwards. The idea behind these mahjong games wasn't to gamble. It was to try your luck against a computer opponent and play a game of mahjong. Some of them were multiplayer as well. But now we're moving back into that area of a video game that is in an area that has historically aroused a spirit of speculation, because people playing mahjong in mahjong parlors are often wagering on the outcomes. And indeed, mahjong parlors are regulated under the amusement control law. Then the other one that's coming in, and these are coming in the United States at the same time, are video poker machines. Video games where you're playing hands of poker. So now in this 1981-1982 period, you're starting to see a massive influx of mahjong and video poker machines into establishments, which are really blurring the line between amusement and non-amusement, because these are areas that, as the Japanese put it, specifically arouse a spirit of speculation.
Which I still say, especially when you have the law that has all those et cetera, allows a lot of wiggle room for interpretation as to what this constitutes as.
Indeed. This is where the real panic begins, is in this 81-82 period. This real feeling that pure amusement games are starting to be replaced by these gambling machines. At the same time, there was apparently a rise in personal bankruptcies attributed to compulsive gambling. at this exact same moment that gambling-style games were entering game centers. This started a movement amongst parents and legislators known as the Objective to Raise Wholesome Youth that started to attack game centers because of this blurring of the lines. Now, many game centers were not necessarily, they often had mahjong games. Mahjong games were very popular across the field, though those games, like I said, weren't set up specifically for betting. Other game centers were not necessarily stocking TV, poker machines, or some of these other forms of gambling. The association, because these video poker machines are video games too, essentially, and these mahjong games are video games too, this is creating an association that is getting harder and harder for the traditional amusement industry to defend itself against. In the public mind, all of these things, metal games and mahjong games and poker machines and all sorts of gambling are being conflated with video games, especially since the invader panic a few years before really blurred that line between those types of machines. By this time, there's a new association. The JAA has been replaced by the Japan Amusement Machine Manufacturers Association, or JAMA. In 1982, JAMA goes the self-regulation route again, because this is getting scary. Parents and legislators are taking note of these poker and mahjong machines and are starting to really fear that there is moral delinquency going on, juvenile delinquency, gambling in these game centers. So they establish what they call the Standards for the Elimination of Gambling Machines, which again is a self-regulation that is basically about keeping those kind of machines, the poker games and whatnot, out of game centers and making sure that no gambling is going on. This time, it's not enough. This is getting very high profile. Parents and legislators are taking note of what's going on. Around this time, you're starting to get this idea of game centers suffering under the 3Ks, which we talked about in one of our Sega episodes. Karai, Kitanai, Kowai, dark, filthy, scary. This idea that these are these dimly lit places where the kids are going in the back to hang out and smoke and do other delinquent activities, where there are gambling machines, they're not well maintained, game centers are a blight. So self-regulation this time is not going to be enough, and the NPA starts really building a case for regulation. In July 1983, they release a white paper addressing gambling with amusement machines, which stated, this is machine translated, it's a direct quote, but it's machine translated, so, it may not be perfectly direct and accurate anymore, but it said around 1979, the amusement machines installed in game centers and similar establishments were mainly skill-based machines, such as invader game machines. But from around the latter half of 1981, non-skill-based machines, such as poker game machines, began to be installed, and these rapidly spread nationwide. They're starting to say, basically, it's not invader games anymore, it's poker games. Even though this white paper, at least this quote from the white paper, doesn't mention mahjong, mahjong is very much on their minds as well. Because at the beginning of 1984, the National Police Agency releases another survey on amusement businesses. They decide that there were 47,710 amusement machines likely to be used for gambling nationwide. That's what this survey revealed to them. Broken down as 32.5% of these machines were TV mahjong games. Even though the earlier white paper focused on poker, they're also noticing the mahjong. 27.5% of these games were TV poker games, which were becoming more prevalent in this time period. 5.8% were TV derby games. That's like horse racing games and whatnot. Then they also talked about slot machines, pinball machines, which is kind of ridiculous, and rhodament machines as well were identified as games that could promote gambling. Pinball being in there is fairly ridiculous because while pinball had been used as a gambling machine from time to time, nobody anymore by 1984 was using pinball for gambling in any meaningful way. But we can see here that the National Police Agency has an agenda now. I feel they're probably still a little bit skeptical of the Invader game boom, and they're definitely skeptical of TV poker and TV mahjong, and they have become convinced that game centers are becoming havens for gambling, and they are going to take action. So that's what they've been building towards. They did this white paper, they did this survey. They feel they have the evidence now that gambling is running amok in these game centers, which is very detrimental to the moral development of the youth, which means it is time to amend the Act on Control and Improvement of Amusement Business to also include game centers.
Which is quite a devastating blow because they're trying to avoid that.
Yes, so there's a few problems with being regulated in this way. I mean, obviously nobody likes regulation, but there are specific problems that would be very detrimental to the business. First of all, game centers, as I said, are 24/7 operations. If they are regulated by this law, that will no longer be the case. They will be closing at like 10 p.m. Second of all, because there is a licensing process involved, a lot of businesses for which running games is not their primary business just aren't going to bother with it. They're not going to want the hassle. It's fine to put some video games in my supermarket or some coin-op games in my supermarket because I don't have to deal with them much. The operator takes care of them. They just bring in a little extra income to the store, so why not? But I'm not necessarily going to go through some kind of rigorous licensing process to have games on my premises because now they're not just, this is a great additional source of extra income with almost no action needed on my part. Now it's like, now I have a bureaucratic headache that I have to deal with. So unless my primary business is actually running these machines, I'm probably not going to bother with them. I'm going to say, I don't want to deal with the licensing, get these machines out of my business.
It's the barrier to entry.
Yeah, it's a barrier to entry.
If it's involved a lot of hoops to jump through, I'm less involved to do that. This is used in all sorts of aspects of life where they try to make things easier or harder under whatever guise they have of safety, security, fighting out corruption, or straight up persecution. It can be used for good and for evil.
Exactly. Then the other thing is, if you're regulated under this law, that means to some degree, the government has decided that your activity is harmful to youths. Like, that's the whole purpose of this law, is protecting the children and protecting a moral society. Being regulated doesn't mean that what you're doing is suddenly illegal. But what it does mean is it's going to have a real negative connotation. Parents are going to start being like, oh, this is regulated because there's a harm to children. So I don't want my children going to game centers even during the periods of time of the day that they're allowed to, because this is clearly a morally corrupting place. You're going to see a decrease in traffic as people believe that this is not a righteous or moral activity to engage in. When you put all of these factors together, the reduction in hours of operation, the reduction in businesses that are probably going to be interested in having these machines around, the negative perception that's going to keep people from coming and playing these games, you're talking about probably a pretty big decrease in the number of machines that you're selling and the number of people that are going to play these machines. This regulation is really serious. There's a reason that in the past we have seen the industry self-regulate every time it looked like there could be a threat of government regulation. And this is why.
How badly did it hurt them?
Well, we're not there yet. I mean, it hurt them. But the interesting story is the story of how this gets passed. The National Police Agency announces on January 30th, 1984, that they are going to pursue this revision of the Amusement Business Control Law to make game centers subject to regulation. So they're the ones pushing for this to happen. Though, of course, the Japanese Diet has to actually amend the law, the legislative body. There are two organizations in Japan, trade organizations, that are involved in coin-operated games. One is JAMA, which we already talked about, and the other is the Japanese Operators Association, the NAO, which is primarily an operators association of the people that actually have the games on their premises. Not surprisingly, both of these organizations are completely against an amendment to the law. However, that changes a couple of months later, because as the National Police Agency continues to define what its position is going to be in trying to get this law passed, it comes out that they are considering only applying this to dedicated game centers, applying this regulation to businesses that are specifically conducted as game centers and not single location sites, such as department store rooftops, candy stores, whatever else. Now, that doesn't end up being the case in the end, spoiler alert. But in this period, there's talk that maybe it'll only be the actual dedicated game centers. Well, the NAO, the Operators Association, the majority of the members of that trade organization run single location sites. They have been losing ground. Like department store rooftops way back in the day used to be one of the primary places where people played these amusements. But they have been losing ground for decades to dedicated game centers, which operate longer and, because they're 24/7 and have a better variety of games and this and that and the other. So suddenly it's like, wait a minute, if they only regulate the game centers, this actually sticks it to our competition and we come out of this looking great. So on March 29th, the NAO actually switches its position and says, well, I guess regulation is kind of inevitable. So yes, we will support this effort to regulate our business because they think it's going to help them and just hurt the game center people.
That sounds like a Faustian bargain or something.
Oh, yes.
I can't help but think that this is similar to what happened half a decade later when the United States had Nintendo and Sega and others in over Mortal Kombat. There was sort of a flip-flop back and forth. Mm-hmm. The gaming industry didn't have a unified front.
Right.
And a few of them went, oh, yeah, sure, regulation's great because it hurts my competition.
Yeah, it's so self-interested and it's so short-sighted. And of course, it ends up being wrong because they end up regulating games generally, not just game centers, but any place that operates them.
Yeah, it's just insane. It's not in their interest.
Yeah. The very next day on March 30th, JAMA, well, first of all, JAMA says, they all crazy and we still oppose this thing. But JAMA actually establishes an operators division within the association because it's like, oh my God, the NAO doesn't really speak for its members anymore, some of its members, because JAMA was a manufacturers association. So they actually open an operators division within their association because they're like, what?
Hey guys, come over here. We actually represent you.
Plus all of the manufacturers, because remember in Japan, companies like Sega, Namco, Taito, they are manufacturers and operators. So they were part of both organizations. All of the major manufacturers withdraw from the NAO because there's no way they want this to happen because this means less machines being sold. Regardless of who gets regulated, this means fewer machines being sold. And so the manufacturers are definitely dead set against this. Some of the local operators associations, because you have a national association, you also have local associations, also stick with their opposition. But the big National Operators Association is for the regulation. It's so funny. It's funny and it's sad.
I'm not sure it's just so much funny as sad.
Exactly. To keep the timeline going, and again, most of this comes from Akagi, on April 17th, the amendment bill, which was drafted by the National Police Agency and then presented to the Liberal Democratic Party's local administration division. I don't know the ins and outs of parliamentary procedure and the diet, but I think that's probably the committee, essentially, that it starts in, was submitted on April 17th and approved by the cabinet, because it's parliamentary democracy, so you have cabinet within the diet, on April 24th to be submitted to the diet as a government-sponsored bill, which it was then submitted as such on April 24th. This is when we finally get a look at what the bill says it's going to regulate, which is, quote, operations in which customers are allowed to play at stores or other comparable partitioned facilities on slot machines, video game machines, or other amusement equipment which, beyond their original purpose, can be used for amusements likely to arouse a spirit of speculation. Then further says that it's limited to those specified by regulations of the National Public Safety Commission. Two things here. First of all, the law is kept somewhat vague, and the National Public Safety Commission is actually going to have broad powers to decide what is actually regulated once the law is passed. Second of all, this legalese around equipment which beyond their original purpose can be used for amusements likely to arouse a spirit of speculation. What this means is we're going to regulate games that we know are not used for gambling, like Donkey Kong or Pac-Man or whatever. Because even though they may not be used for gambling now, you could theoretically swap out that board with another board and then suddenly have a video poker machine instead of a Donkey Kong or a Pac-Man machine.
So because of the JAMA standard, we are afraid that you are suddenly going to have kids who secretly push a button and it switches from friendly, child-friendly Donkey Kong to Donkey Kong poker extravaganza. The kid gets to gamble away his lunch money in order to win a potted plant.
Exactly, because the JAMA standard is, I think, still a year away at this point, but it's coming. But even at this time, you had things like the Deco system, the Data East cassette system, and the Nintendo VS system, where you had interchangeability, where you could swap out games. So, yeah, there was this fear. It's like, we're not just going to regulate obvious gambling games, but any game which can be beyond its original purpose used for amusements likely to rouse the spirit of speculation.
So they're preempting hot coffee before hot coffee by about 20 years.
Yes. The fight over this bill is actually pretty long and involved. It's submitted in April. Deliberations around the bill begin in June. Things move kind of slowly. June 21st, still in 1984 here. But the bill is regulating actual slot machines, like actual potential gambling devices, and video game machines that even by the definition of the bill could be at the moment they are installed just be used for amusement purposes. It's an incredibly contradictory bill. That's what Akagi says, and I agree with him. It's incredibly contradictory because you're lumping in gambling and non-gambling machines, and you're saying all of them need to be regulated because maybe someday, somehow, someone will turn one of these machines into a gambling machine.
Just think of what a bad precedent that is. If you can do that with video games and poker machines and whatever, one-armed bandits, you could apply that to practically anything else in life as a result. I can be like, you can't have a rolling pin because it might be used as a club. You can't have a light because you might take apart that light, use the wires, and shock someone.
Right. I mean, it borders on the ridiculous. They are in part playing into a moral panic because I do believe at this time there was a moral panic around video gambling machines, particularly TV poker and to a lesser extent TV mahjong. So they're playing into a moral panic to justify a ridiculously extensive regulation. There's a fight over it. The opposition party, the main opposition party, the Japan Socialist Party, really doesn't understand this. And they actually tried to issue an amendment on July the 5th that would limit regulation to metal games and slot machines that were originally intended for gambling, plus any video game machines like video poker machines that are actually initially designed for gambling. But that was not adopted. The Liberal Democratic Party gets it through, and it moves on to the upper house of the Imperial Diet, the House of Councilors. The House of Councilors is really skeptical about this at first. It looks like there's going to be a pretty big fight here. So what happens, and this is just, shenanigans, Jeffrey, shenanigans.
Isn't that most of life, Alex? Shenanigans?
Yes. So you may recall that I said that the NAO, the Operators Association, decided to support the regulation. So they actually conspire with the National Police Agency. They hold two demonstrations, one on July the 7th and one on July 26th, for members of the House of Councilors, where they presented the Nintendo VS system, the Data East Deco system, and a perfectly ordinary non-system-based game, a Sun Electronics game called The Guinness, and demonstrated to them how each of these could be replaced. The systems, the VS system, the Deco system, and a regular PCB game. How they could be replaced with a new game cassette, game cartridge, or circuit board that suddenly turned them into a gambling game. Then they implied, they may have even flat out said, I don't know, that this was a common practice. So the Operators Association that operates these games conspired with the National Police Agency to fool the legislature, the Diet, into thinking that not only can this happen, but it is widespread.
All I can think of is just like Fred Rogers in front of Congress making the case for why you don't need to regulate and need to allow home video cassette things so that people could watch his show as a family. Almost like an evil version of Fred Rogers in front of the parliament here, just going, yes, this is all evil, here's why. And it single-handedly wins the case.
Right, but, the thing that blows my mind about it is it's the organization whose business is being targeted, whose business is being impacted, that is helping make this happen. That would be like if the NRA suddenly said, oh no, you're right. Guns do cause unnecessary fatalities, and we're going to work with the government to show you how dangerous guns are. That'd be like the NRA in the United States doing that. I mean, this is pretty much the same thing.
Are they still under a state of delusion here that this is somehow going to the larger operators and not them?
Yes, I think that exactly. That's exactly right. They think they're going to benefit from this, but of course they're not going to benefit from this.
The ability sometimes for people to not do things in their own self-interest because they just want to stick it to other people astounds me sometimes.
Then things get really weird because the focus has been on those types of things I talked about before, like metal games. Slot machines in this case really refers to metal games, amusement machines and whatnot. There are other types of machines that were not going to fall under regulation and would probably be banned outright. So then the NAO, they're working kind of both sides of the field here. They also convince the National Police Agency to allow other types of machines that would otherwise be banned outright, like poker machines and roulette machines.
But poker and roulette machines are actual gambling machines.
Exactly. But the idea is, similar to the metal games where it's like, we're going to regulate this. We're not going to make them illegal, but we're going to regulate so that they're only used in an upright way. The NAO argued that the games themselves don't create the harm. It's the way the equipment is used. So if we regulate these and have it all out in the open, then it's okay. Finally, there's months more of deliberation. This goes on. Finally, in January of 1985, the final group of machines that are to be regulated is announced. It's 5 categories of games. Slot machines and other amusement equipment structured so that the result of play is indicated by the number of medals or similar items. So these are medal games. These are the games where you put a coin in, it works like a gambling machine, but you're paid out in medals. Television game machines, limited to those with functions allowing play for the purpose of competing in win-loss, or those in which the result of play is displayed on a cathode ray tube in numbers, letters, or other symbols, excluding those clearly not used for amusements likely to arouse a spirit of speculation. In theory, this means video games that only have a direct betting element in them. 3, flipper game machines. That's pinball. They call them flipper games. 4, amusement equipment other than those listed in items 1 through 3 used for play in which the result is indicated by numbers, letters, symbols, or objects, blah, blah, blah. So basically, any other amusement game as well that has a gambling element, even if it's not covered by the other categories. Then roulette tables, playing cards, and card tables and other amusement equipment used for games similar to roulette or card games. So we're going to legalize regulated, roulette and playing card stuff because the NAO lobbied for it. This makes it sound like pure amusement games are going to be legal under the law because the law has actually been narrowed a little bit here to say that it's really only those games that have the purpose of win-loss or the result of play, gambling machines. But remember, the law also says that the National Public Safety Commission is the one that gets to ultimately decide what kind of machines are going to be regulated. So the National Police Agency pretty much immediately says, you might think that this doesn't count for invader games and similar kind of amusement games, but we're going to regulate those too. They only made a very narrow exception for 2 types of games. Whack-a-mole style electromechanical games and driving games where you have a sit down, where you have a cockpit type enclosure with a pilot seat, a driving game where you're sitting in like a model of a car. Those are the only things that they exclude when they issue their own regulations on top of the law. The law finally goes live February 13th, 1985. So that's when this all starts. In a kind of funny denouement here, we've of course talked about Sega's Hang On, the motorcycle game Yu Suzuki. We did a whole episode on Yu Suzuki. We may recall that it was one of the first of the take-on or motion games where you're actually sitting on a motorcycle and, you're moving left and right on the motorcycle. It's a motion cabinet and everything. Sega unveils it for the first time in July 1985. And when they unveil it, they specifically say that this was developed specifically so it would be exempt from regulation because it fits into that category of driving games that are specifically exempted. So they promised it would be free of regulation as a way to try to get more sales. Then the National Police Agency said, no, actually, your game is also subject to regulation. Okay, thanks, bye.
They can just unilaterally do whatever.
Right, because the law gives them the full power to establish the standards. So they can make the argument, even though it looks vaguely like it may only apply to games that have gambling, the whole arouse the spirit of speculation thing gives them broad leeway to say, well, I can see a scenario where this would arouse the spirit of speculation. They can just crack down on it. It's so crazy. Yeah, the law comes into effect February 1985. It's still in effect to this day. It definitely had impacts on the business. The business did decline pretty significantly in the 84, 85, 86 time period. During the period of time when the law started to be deliberated, was announced and deliberated and passed and started to be enforced. The other thing is I'm pretty sure it definitely steered some companies away from the coin-op business. I know in Nintendo's case, this is absolutely true. Nintendo exits coin-op in 1985 in Japan. They keep going for a few more years in the United States, but in Japan, they exit in 1985, and it's because they do not want to be associated with this because their background was in toys and, way back when they were in Hanafuda, they were in gambling. Ironically, they have gambling ties too, but even though they still even produce Hanafuda cards in 1985, they've largely reinvented themselves as a toy company, a family company, and they don't want to be associated with this. I'm pretty sure as well this is why companies like Sega started to get themselves into the home console business as well. They got in before this specific law was being deliberated because, Sega and Nintendo both launched their systems in 1983. But I do think that the constant moral panic and the constant threat of more stringent regulation is what caused a lot of these companies to figure that they needed to diversify their business into areas that were not subject to this, like toys, like home video game systems, which have never been subject to the same level of scrutiny. Of course, it had positive effects too, because it did have the effect of the major companies wanting to really clean up their game centers. They wanted to counter this image of the 3Ks. So they started building bigger, cleaner, more elaborate, better lit game centers. And this started the move towards kind of the amusement park style game centers that would come up even a few years after that, like Joypolis and Wonder Egg, because it's the idea that there's a stigma here and we have to eliminate that stigma. We have to be better.
Sort of like Aladdin's Castle in the United States.
Exactly. So I think it spurred some positive effects on how game centers developed as well, but it definitely changed the landscape of the business, and it definitely changed the perception of coin-operated games, and it guaranteed that from then on, coin-operated games in Japan, those companies would be operating with one hand tied behind their backs because they could never necessarily reach their full potential in widespread distribution and adoption because at a certain point, that regulation inhibits that growth. Japanese game centers still had obviously many years of success. Started to decline a little in the 2000s, really started to decline with COVID. So it's not like they went away or anything, but it definitely changed the nature of the business. I think it pushed them into the home more forcefully. It pushed for a new understanding of what a game center looks like, what a game center is, and, continues to shape what's left of the industry to this day. There you have it. That is the wild story of the attempts at self-regulation, ultimately ending in the passage of the amendment to the Act on Control and Improvement of Amusement Business.
I don't know what to say outside of don't burn the forest down if you're going to stay in the forest. Because, dear God, just
Exactly.
Fighting against your own best interest always amazes me.
Absolutely.
All right, Alex. Well, this is December 15th. Next comes January 1st, a whole new year for They Create Worlds. Dear God, we've been doing this a while. So how are we going to kick off the new year?
Well, I think a new year deserves a new world, since we are, after all, They Create Worlds.
Considering we create them, I believe that's apropos.
Just recently, at the time of this recording, there was a new book released on the Heroes of Might and Magic series celebrating its 30th anniversary, with a few interviews and whatnot around the creation of the series, as well as more broadly on New World Computing, the company responsible for the series. There's still not as much information out there on New World as there are some companies. I really wish there were more, but I think there's enough out there now that we can do a decent stab at a history of New World computing with a focus on Might and Magic and Heroes of Might and Magic. That sounds like, in honor of this new book that has come out from Neil Halford, that it'll make a lot of that possible. I think it's time we take a look at New World computing.
You just brought back horrible memories of having to fight IRQ in order to get the sound card, the video card, to play nicely so I could play World of Zine.
You're welcome, Jeffrey.
Well, I'm going to go take advantage of the New Year celebrations in order to forget those horrible memories. And we'll see you next time on They Create World. Check out our show notes at podcast.theycreateworlds.com, where we have links to some of the things we discussed in this and other episodes. You can check out Alex's video game history blog at videogamehistorian.wordpress.com. Alex's book, They Create Worlds, the story of the people and companies that shaped the video game industry, Volume 1, can now be ordered through CRC Press and at major online retailers. Feel free to email us at feedback@theycreateworlds.com. Please consider supporting us on Patreon at patreon.com/theycreateworlds. If you do decide to support us, please do so through the website and not through the iOS app. This saves you from the 30% Apple markup. We understand that you may not be able to financially support us, but you can still support us by leaving a review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and the podcasting service that you use. The podcast is now available on YouTube. Please like and subscribe. Intro music is Airplane Mode by Josh Woodward, found at joshwoodward.com/song/airplane mode, used under a Creative Commons Attribution license. Outro music is Bacterial Love by Roll Music, found at freemusicarchives.org, used under a Creative Commons Attribution license. Oh no, why did my World of Zine disc break? I'm doomed! Doomed!